Welcome to 28 Storms. This is your tropical weather update for the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic on this Friday, June 17th, 2011. There are three main features on the maps today. Of course, we still have the tropical disturbance near the Gulf of Tehuantepec in the Eastern Pacific. This is 92E Invest. The National Hurricane Center is now giving this a 50% chance of forming into a tropical cyclone within the next 48 hours. We'll take a very detailed look at that. We also have two tropical waves worth noting out in the Atlantic Basin today. One is over the Western Caribbean, and the other one is approaching 50 degrees west longitude out here in the Central Atlantic. If we take a look at the latest enhanced infrared imagery of today, we'll notice that our tropical wave is fairly impressive out here in the Central Atlantic for this time of the year, although if you notice there's a lot of cloud tops being blown off toward the northeast, and that's in response to a lot of southwest wind shear aloft, and we're not expecting any development from that feature in the coming week. Now, in terms of the tropical wave over the Western Caribbean, this is also very disorganized, and it's also being sheared fairly badly by southwest shear aloft, but some of that wind shear is acting to enhance the convection this afternoon, and it looks fairly impressive compared to yesterday. Overall, this tropical wave will be moving off toward the west-northwest, eventually getting into the Bay of Campeche, but no development is expected over the next 3 to 4 days due to that wind shear that we've talked about, and also a lot of land interaction as it begins to move over Honduras, Nicaragua, Belize, and the surrounding Yucatan Peninsula. Here's a quick look at the water vapor imagery, and as you can see, there is a lot of dry air for that tropical wave out in the Central Atlantic, and there's all that wind shear I'm telling you about. And also here's another unfavorable trough just ahead of this tropical wave. Here's a more detailed look at the tropical disturbance in the Eastern Pacific, and as we've seen, day by day, this system has become just a little bit more organized, thus the reason why the official chances of development are up to 50% within the next 48 hours. As we can see, there's continued low-level turning here noticed on the visible imagery, and also we've seen an increase in convection located or concentrated near that center a little bit better today compared to the last 72 hours. So overall, the system does look healthier compared to yesterday, and we still appear to be on track for this storm to eventually become a tropical depression. Although it's been a little bit slower than expected, it still looks like it's going to occur. Now, one negative for tropical development over the next 24 to 36 hours is that we are beginning to see a slight dry air intrusion from the north, and obviously tropical cyclones would much rather have a lot of moisture in the atmosphere compared to dry air. Now, it looks like as this system begins to continue moving more toward the west, dry air could be less of a factor. So overall, it still looks like conditions are good over the next 4 to 5 days for continued intensification. Now, taking one step backward, though, I do want to indicate the reason why we have that dry air coming in from the north. Well, first off, we have a mid-level ridge over here in central Mexico, and the mid to upper-level flow on the eastern side of that ridge is from north to south, and that's why we're seeing that north to south movement of the dry air. Now, the reason why the dry air exists in the first place is because on the backside of these shortwave troughs, we often see a lot of sinking air in the upper levels, thus the reason why the air begins to dry. Now, the reason why this is occurring is because on the backside of troughs, we have a lot of sinking air because of converging winds aloft, and the air has no other place to go but straight down into the mid to lower levels, and the natural process is for that air to begin to dry and sink. And obviously, the storms do not like this, but as noted, this storm will continue moving more toward the west, where dry air could become less of a problem or a factor. Now, in terms of upper-level shear over the Eastern Pacific, we do have some slight easterly winds aloft in excess of about 5 to 10 knots. Probably not anything enough to really inhibit further continued intensification, but we would still rather have this tropical disturbance be centered closer to this upper-level ridge over inland Mexico, but that doesn't look like that's going to be the case. But again, upper-level winds do not appear to be strong enough to completely disrupt at least slow development. Now, before we take a more detailed look at the overall model guidance, I want viewers to realize that this is going to be a very tricky forecast for both forecasters and the forecast models to handle. Overall, though, what's going to occur over the next 7 days is that this large subtropical ridge that dominates all of the weather across the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf of Mexico will temporarily weaken, especially over the western half of the basin. As a result, the monsoon trough that's over the southwest Caribbean and eastern Pacific will be allowed to lift north a little bit. Now, in response to that monsoon trough lifting north, some of the model guidance would like to develop a second area of low pressure, but this time on the northern side of Central America, closer to the southwest Gulf of Mexico. Now, whether or not that surface low develops or not will depend on exactly where it is in respect to these land masses. Obviously, if it stays more over Mexico or Central America, we will not have anything to worry about in terms of tropical storm formation in the Gulf. But again, if that low were to begin to meander out over open waters of the Gulf for an extended period of time, then that could possibly be something to watch down the road. In the meantime, though, the main focus will be on our developing low in the eastern Pacific, and that will also have to be correctly modeled by the forecast models, because all of this is connected in one way or another. And if the models don't get this right, then chances are they won't get right what they're currently forecasting for the Gulf of Mexico down the road either. With all that in mind, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the latest low-level vorticity forecast from the GFS. As you can see, it briefly begins to continue developing our tropical disturbance out in the eastern Pacific, but then that mid-level ridge over Mexico begins to give way, thus allowing this entire monsoon trough to begin shifting north into the southwest Gulf of Mexico. But before that occurs, it looks like our tropical system in the eastern Pacific begins to weaken before it goes inland. And then, of course, at the end of this run, it begins to focus much of the low-level energy into the Gulf, where it tries to develop a second tropical system. Here is a more detailed look at the GFS sea level pressure and precipitation forecast. This starts off at 84 hours, and as you can see, this is our remnant low pressure area associated with the tropical disturbance here. And as I advance this, that low pressure begins to weaken a little bit, while some of the moisture gets dragged across Mexico and into the southwest Gulf, and then it begins to develop a second area of sea level pressure just to the east of Tampico. And with time, it begins to take it more toward the north into southern Texas, which would be some much needed beneficial rainfall. But at this point in the forecast, that's really far out. This is now between the 9 and 10 day time frame, so obviously we can't expect this model to be that accurate. This is not the most favorable upper level pattern, but the GFS does show the favorable upper level ridge currently situated across central Mexico, shifting ever so slightly toward the east. This is by 162 hours, almost day 7. We have a very weak area of upper level ridging right along the Mexican coast with the Gulf of Mexico. And we can also see this a little bit on the NCEP website. We have a very broad area of upper level anticyclonic motion over the central and western Gulf of Mexico, with some troughiness beginning to stretch down toward Texas and Louisiana. Now, this is the latest European model's take on things, and usually I would show you the day-to-day progression of the model, but frankly, every single day looks generally the same once you get beyond day 5. This is the current day 5 sea level pressure forecast, and it is developing a weak 1006 millibar low right off the coast of Mexico in the southwest Gulf of Mexico. But unlike the GFS, it keeps it close enough to the Mexican coastline that it's really not far off the coast enough to really develop into a more intense tropical feature. In the meantime, the tropical cyclone down in the eastern Pacific did intensify a bit on this model solution as it continued moving more toward the west-northwest. And you can see by day 7, once that mid-level ridge begins to move east a little bit, it allows the eastern Pacific storm to turn north, but by this point it's very weak. It's at 1007 millibars and more than likely below tropical depression status. In the meantime, we now have the secondary area of low pressure in the southwest Gulf of Mexico, but as I alluded to, this model keeps it too close to the Mexican coastline for it to really intensify or strengthen. So, to sum up what we have out there today, I still expect there to be a tropical depression classified in the eastern Pacific within the next 36 to 48 hours. It will more than likely intensify into Tropical Storm Beatrice, although I really do not expect much more than a weak tropical storm at this time. And it looks as though the storm will remain primarily off of Mexico's coastline. If it were to turn more toward the north in the medium range, it would likely do so while dissipating as the southwest winds were to increase in the upper levels, thus shearing the storm apart a bit. So we're not looking at any major impacts along Mexico's coast, but as always, we do recommend that you keep a close watch on the tropics, as things can always change a little bit. And down the road, if there is anything to watch in the Atlantic Basin, it will be the southwest Gulf of Mexico as the monsoon trough does begin to inch toward the north. Some of the models do show some weak tropical storm development down there, but it's really far out. And other models do not show much of anything. So it's just something that we'll keep a close watch out for here at 28storms.com. And we hope you have a good weekend. And we'll also continue to update the webpage, so check back often for more continuous updates.